Some financial mistakes happen suddenly. Others happen slowly, quietly, over years. But the most dangerous financial mistakes are the ones people refuse to talk about. Because silence can be expensive. Sometimes it costs a family their savings. Sometimes it costs a marriage its stability. And sometimes it costs a family their home. Today on Teeza True Life Story, we explore the real-life case of a couple who believed ignoring their financial problems would somehow make them disappear. But as the months passed, the debt kept growing. The bills kept arriving. And the truth they refused to face eventually arrived in the form of a single envelope from the bank. By the time they opened that letter, it was already too late. From the outside, David and Sarah looked like a stable middle-class couple. They lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Manchester. Their home wasn't extravagant, but it was comfortable. A modest 3-bedroom house with a small garden in the back, the kind of home people work years to afford. David worked as a logistics supervisor for a regional delivery company. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was stable. He had been with the company for nearly 12 years. Sarah worked part-time at a dental clinic as a receptionist. Her job helped cover some of the household expenses while also giving her the flexibility to care for their 2 children. For most of their marriage, life had followed a predictable rhythm. Paychecks arrived, bills were paid, groceries were purchased, and the mortgage payment quietly left their bank account every month. But financial stability often hides a dangerous truth. It creates the illusion that everything will always stay the same. And when that illusion becomes comfortable, people stop asking difficult questions. They stop examining their finances carefully. They stop preparing for the unexpected. And sometimes, they stop talking about money altogether. At first, the warning signs were small, so small that most families would have ignored them. The first problem appeared in the form of a credit card statement. It arrived one Tuesday afternoon. David noticed it while sorting through the mail at the kitchen counter. The balance was higher than usual, much higher, nearly £7,800. At first he assumed it must be a mistake, but after reviewing the statement carefully, he realized something troubling. The card had been used regularly for months, shopping, online purchases, furniture, clothing, small expenses that had quietly accumulated into a large balance. That evening, David mentioned it casually during dinner. "Hey, Sarah," he said carefully, trying not to sound confrontational. "I noticed the credit card balance is getting pretty high." Sarah barely looked up from her plate. "It's fine," she replied quickly. "It's just temporary." David nodded slowly. He didn't want to turn the conversation into an argument, but something about her response unsettled him. It wasn't the debt itself. Many families carry some level of credit card balance. The problem was something else. Sarah didn't seem concerned at all. In fact, she seemed determined not to discuss it. Over the following months, David tried bringing up the topic again. Each time, the conversation ended the same way. Sarah dismissed the issue. "It's under control. We'll deal with it later. You worry too much." Eventually, David stopped asking. And that decision would become the first step toward a much larger financial disaster. Financial experts often talk about budgeting, investing, and saving. But there is another factor that rarely gets discussed openly: financial psychology, the way people emotionally respond to money problems. Some people react to financial stress with urgency. They analyze the situation, they cut expenses, they create a plan. But others respond differently. They avoid the problem entirely. This psychological pattern is called financial avoidance, and it is more common than most people realize. When people feel overwhelmed by debt, their brain sometimes chooses the easiest emotional solution: denial. If they don't look at the numbers, if they don't talk about the bills, if they don't open certain letters, Then the problem temporarily disappears from their mind. But in the real world, debt does not disappear. It grows quietly in the background. Interest accumulates. Payments are missed. Penalties appear. And the longer the problem remains ignored, the more destructive it becomes. Sarah had fallen into this exact pattern. At first, the credit card debt was manageable, but because she refused to confront it, the balance continued to increase. By the end of the year, the debt had doubled, and David still didn't know the full extent of the situation. For a while, life continued normally in the Parker household. The children went to school. David went to work each morning before sunrise. Sarah managed the household routines in her part-time job at the dental clinic. On the surface, nothing appeared dramatically wrong. But beneath that calm routine, the family's financial situation was slowly deteriorating. What David didn't realize was that the credit card he had seen months earlier was only one part of the problem. Sarah had opened a second credit card, then a third. At first, she told herself it was temporary. The first card had reached its limit, so she used another to cover expenses: groceries, school supplies, unexpected household repairs. But slowly, the spending began to shift. Small comforts started appearing: online shopping orders, decorations for the house, clothing purchases that felt harmless in the moment. Each purchase seemed minor, but debt rarely arrives all at once. It arrives quietly, in small decisions repeated many times. And the most dangerous part of Sarah's situation wasn't the spending. It was the silence. She still refused to talk about the money. Every time David mentioned their finances, she quickly redirected the conversation. "Everything's fine," she would say. "We just need to get through this month." But this month quietly turned into another, then another, and the balances kept growing. What Sarah didn't realize was that financial problems rarely stay hidden forever. Eventually, they reveal themselves, often in the worst possible moment. One rainy Thursday afternoon, David arrived home earlier than usual. His shift had ended unexpectedly after a logistics system failure at the warehouse. When he walked through the front door, he noticed something unusual on the kitchen counter: a small stack of unopened envelopes. Most people don't pay attention to mail, but something about these envelopes caught his attention. They were different from the usual household letters, thicker, more official looking. David picked one up. The sender was a credit card company. He frowned. He didn't remember opening a card with that bank. Curiosity slowly turned into concern. Without thinking too much about it, he opened the envelope. Inside was a statement. Balance due, £12,460. For a moment, David assumed it must be a mistake. But then he noticed the name printed on the account: Sarah Parker. His chest tightened, and that was when the realization hit him. This wasn't the card he had seen months earlier. This was a different credit card entirely. David sat down slowly at the kitchen table. His mind began racing through possibilities. Had there been some emergency expense he didn't know about? Medical bills? Something related to the children? But as he opened the second envelope, his concern deepened. Another credit card. Balance, £8,300. By the time David finished going through the stack of mail, the truth became impossible to ignore. The household was carrying over £30,000 in credit card debt, and he had known almost nothing about it. When Sarah arrived home later that evening, she immediately noticed the open envelopes on the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. David looked up slowly. His voice wasn't angry. It was something worse, confused. "Sarah, what is this?" For many couples, that moment would have started a serious conversation, a difficult but necessary discussion about finances, a chance to face the problem together. But Sarah reacted very differently. The moment she saw the letters, her expression hardened. She walked past the table without answering. "It's nothing," she said quietly. David stared at her. "Nothing, Sarah. This is 30,000 pounds. Still, she refused to sit down, refused to discuss the numbers, refused to look at the statements. Instead, she responded with the same emotional defense mechanism she had used for months: avoidance. "You're overreacting," she said. "We'll figure it out." David felt frustration building inside him. "Sarah, we have to talk about this." But Sarah shook her head. "Not tonight." Then she walked into the bedroom and closed the door. That night, neither of them slept well. David lay awake staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed the numbers over and over again. 30,000 pounds, multiple credit cards, interest rates climbing every month, and one frightening thought he couldn't shake. If the credit card situation was this bad, what else didn't he know? Because financial avoidance rarely affects just one problem. It often spreads into every area of a household's finances. And unfortunately for David and Sarah, their biggest problem was still hidden: the mortgage. And within a few months, that problem would begin to reveal itself in a way neither of them were prepared for. In the weeks following that night, the atmosphere inside the Parker household changed. Something invisible had entered the home, not a physical presence, but a quiet tension that seemed to sit in every room. David began paying closer attention to the mail, to the bank notifications, to the small details he had once ignored. And that was when another troubling pattern began to appear. The phone started ringing more often. At first, it happened during the afternoon while Sarah was home. Calls from unfamiliar numbers. Most people ignore unknown callers. But Sarah's reaction was different. Whenever the phone rang, she would glance at the screen, hesitate for a moment, and then quickly silence the call. David noticed, but he said nothing. Then, one evening, the phone rang again while they were sitting together in the living room. This time, David reached the phone first. He answered it before Sarah could stop him. "Hello?" There was a short pause on the other end. Then a calm but firm voice spoke. "Good evening. Am I speaking with Sarah Parker regarding an outstanding balance on her account?" David felt his stomach tighten. The caller introduced himself as a representative from a debt collection agency. The account they were referring to was one of Sarah's credit cards. The payment had been overdue for several months. Interest had accumulated. Late fees had been added. The balance had increased significantly. As David listened to the caller explain the situation, something became painfully clear. This problem was no longer simply about credit card spending. It had moved into a more serious stage: debt collection. After the call ended, David slowly placed the phone back on the table. Sarah sat silently on the couch, staring at the floor. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, David broke the silence. "How long has this been happening?" Sarah's voice was quiet. "A while." The answer was vague, too vague, and David knew it. Over the next few days, David began examining their finances more carefully than he ever had before. For years, he had trusted that everything was under control. Like many couples, they had divided responsibilities. David handled the mortgage. Sarah managed day-to-day household expenses. But trust can sometimes become dangerous when it replaces verification. As David reviewed their bank accounts, he noticed something troubling. Several payments had been made using cash advances from credit cards. Those advances had then been deposited into their joint account. At first, he didn't understand why, but slowly, the pattern became clear. Sarah had been using new debt to temporarily cover existing expenses. Mortgage payments, utility bills, groceries. The family's normal living costs had quietly started exceeding their income, and instead of adjusting their lifestyle or addressing the problem openly, Sarah had tried to bridge the gap with credit, month after month, year after year, until the numbers became impossible to manage. But the most alarming discovery came when David opened their mortgage account. He stared at the screen for several seconds, unsure if he was reading it correctly. 2 payments were marked as late. 1 payment had not been made at all. David's heart began beating faster. The mortgage was the foundation of their entire financial stability. Everything else could be negotiated. Credit cards could be restructured, loans could be refinanced. But a mortgage delinquency was different. If it continued, the house itself could be at risk. When Sarah came home later that evening, David was waiting at the kitchen table. The mortgage statement was open in front of him. His voice was calm, but the concern was obvious. "Sarah, why are the mortgage payments late?" For the first time in months, Sarah didn't deflect the question immediately. Instead, she sat down slowly. Her shoulders sagged, and the truth began to emerge piece by piece. Sarah had never intended for things to spiral this far. In the beginning, the situation had seemed manageable. A few unexpected expenses, some credit card balances that could be paid down later. But financial stress often creates a dangerous emotional loop. The more overwhelming the numbers become, the more people avoid confronting them. Sarah had stopped checking the balances on her credit cards months earlier. She avoided opening statements, ignored reminder emails, deleted bank notifications. Because every time she saw the numbers, she felt the same overwhelming emotion. Shame. Shame for letting the debt grow. Shame for not telling David sooner. Shame for losing control of something she believed she should have been able to manage. So instead of facing the problem, she had hidden from it. But avoidance does not erase financial obligations. It only delays the moment when they finally demand attention. And now that moment was approaching quickly. The mortgage payments had been missed because Sarah had used the money to cover minimum payments on several credit cards. She believed she could catch up the following month, but another unexpected expense appeared, then another. And soon the missed payments began stacking on top of each other. By the time Sarah realized how serious the situation had become, she felt trapped. Telling David the truth seemed impossible. So she continued pretending everything was fine, until the day the debt collector started calling. And now, sitting across from her husband at the kitchen table, Sarah finally understood something painful. The problem she had tried so hard to hide was now impossible to hide anymore. And unfortunately, the bank had already begun paying attention, because when mortgage payments stop arriving, banks do not remain silent forever. A week after their difficult conversation at the kitchen table, another envelope arrived. It looked like any other letter, white, plain, official. But this one carried a different weight. David noticed the logo immediately. It was from their mortgage lender. He held the envelope in his hands for several seconds before opening it. Sometimes people hesitate before opening letters like this, because deep down, they already know what the letter will say. And in that quiet moment, they are hoping, just for a second, that the situation might somehow still be fixable. But reality has a way of arriving whether people are ready or not. David slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a document titled, "Notice of Mortgage Arrears." 3 payments were now overdue. The bank explained that if the balance was not brought up to date within a specific time frame, further action could be taken. Legal action, foreclosure proceedings, repossession of the property. David read the letter twice, then a third time. Each sentence felt heavier than the last. For years, that house had represented stability, security, a place where birthdays were celebrated, where the children had taken their first steps, where family memories had quietly accumulated over time. But suddenly, that stability felt fragile, like something slipping slowly through their hands. When Sarah came home later that evening, David handed her the letter without saying a word. She read it silently. By the time she reached the final paragraph, tears were forming in her eyes. For the first time since the financial problems began, Sarah fully understood the gravity of the situation. The house was no longer just under financial pressure. It was in real danger. In the weeks that followed, David and Sarah tried desperately to fix the situation. They contacted the bank, requested payment plans, explored refinancing options. But financial problems that build over years cannot always be solved in a few weeks. The credit card balances were too high. The missed mortgage payments had already triggered internal reviews by the lender, and most importantly, the household income was no longer enough to catch up on everything. Every night became a discussion about numbers, budgets, interest rates, minimum payments, debt restructuring. The conversations were exhausting, but they were also painful reminders of something deeper. This situation had not appeared suddenly. It had grown slowly, quietly, over time, and the moment when it could have been solved more easily had already passed. One morning, about 2 months after the warning letter arrived, another document appeared in the mail. This one was thicker, more formal, and far more serious. It was a legal notice confirming that foreclosure proceedings had officially begun. For several minutes, David simply sat at the table, staring at the paper. Sarah stood beside him, unable to speak. Because sometimes the most painful moment in a financial crisis is not the beginning. It is the moment when people realize the consequences can no longer be avoided, the moment when the problem becomes final. 3 months later, the family began packing. The process felt surreal. Cardboard boxes filled the living room, closets were emptied, drawers cleared. Every object in the house seemed to carry a memory. The children didn't fully understand what was happening. They knew they were moving, but they didn't know why. And sometimes adults try to shield children from financial hardship, but children often sense the emotional weight in the room, the quiet conversations, the stress, the sadness that lingers in the air. On the final day, David stood alone in the kitchen for a moment before leaving. He looked around slowly. The same kitchen where he had once opened that first credit card statement, the same table where they had argued about money, the same room where they had shared hundreds of ordinary family dinners, and he realized something painful. The house had not been lost in a single moment. It had been lost slowly, through months of silence, years of avoidance, and countless opportunities where a difficult conversation could have changed the outcome. Outside, the moving van was waiting. Sarah stood near the front door, holding a small box of personal items. Her eyes were red from crying. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, because sometimes the consequences of financial decisions do not appear immediately. They appear later, quietly, after the damage has already been done. And the hardest part is realizing that many of those consequences could have been prevented if only someone had been willing to talk about the problem sooner. Stories like this are not rare. In fact, financial experts see situations like this every single day. Not because people are careless, not because they lack intelligence, but because money problems often trigger powerful emotions: fear, shame, embarrassment. And when those emotions become overwhelming, many people choose the same coping strategy Sarah did. Avoidance. They stop opening letters, stop checking bank accounts, stop discussing finances with their partner. But financial problems do not disappear when ignored. They grow quietly, relentlessly, until one day the consequences arrive in a form that cannot be ignored anymore. A legal notice, a repossession order, a foreclosure letter. The true lesson of David and Sarah's story is not just about debt, it is about communication. Because the most dangerous financial habit any household can develop is silence. When couples stop talking about money, small problems have space to become enormous ones. But when financial problems are faced early, openly, and honestly, many disasters can be prevented. Thank you for watching Teeza True Life Story. On this channel, we explore real-life stories that reveal the hidden financial, psychological, and emotional lessons many people only learn the hard way. If this story made you reflect on your own financial habits, take a moment to share it with someone who might benefit from hearing this lesson. Because sometimes, a single conversation about money can prevent years of regret. And if you want to continue learning powerful life lessons through real stories about finances, relationships, and the decisions that shape our lives, make sure you subscribe to Teeza True Life Story and join us again for the next case, because every story carries a lesson. And sometimes, the right lesson at the right time can change a life.